I'm very, very happy and excited to introduce Parker Palmer tonight. How very fortunate we are to have you with us, Parker. I will mention that Parker wanted so much to be here in person, and that was the original plan because he really was excited about talking about the future of Friends of Quakerism, which we will get to hear, but we just will do it over Zoom, which we're happy also to have that capacity. Parker Palmer is a writer, speaker, and activist who focuses on issues in education, community, leadership, spirituality, and social change. He is founder and senior partner emeritus of the Center for Courage and Renewal, which offers long-term retreat programs for people in the serving professions, including teachers, physicians, nonprofit leaders, and clergy. Parker holds a PhD in sociology from the University of California at Berkeley, as well as receiving 13 honorary doctorates, 2 Distinguished Achievement Awards from the National Education Press Association, and an Award of Excellence from the Associated Church Press. Parker is author of 10 books, including several award-winning titles that have sold nearly 2 million copies and been translated into 10 languages. But I would say that the highest compliment to you, Parker, is that we have heard from so many teachers and professors, both at Earlham and at ESR, that they use your books in their classes. That's the highest compliment. Parker has had so many awards. I've got a list on this paper, but I'm not going to read them because we want to hear Parker. You don't want to hear me talking. So just to say, we're so grateful to Parker for his love of Quakers and his love of humanity. Really, you're a real champion, Parker, for the human spirit, and we're grateful. We're going to enter into some worship, and that will allow Parker to speak out of the silence. And after we hear from Parker, Tom Ham will lead us and facilitate questions, and he'll be able to take them both from people on Zoom and from people in this room at ESR. So with that, let us settle into worship.
Thank you. Thank you for coming tonight to hear the lecture and to share in the conversation afterwards. Thanks to everyone who has worked hard to set this up. I'm very honored and grateful to be invited to give the first annual Perkins Family Lecture, which I've chosen to call All Real Living is Meeting, Close Encounters of the Quaker Kind. I have two goals tonight. First, I want to lift up some features of Quaker faith and practice that began transforming my life and work 50 years ago. Features that could, I believe, help transform our world. Second, I want to talk about all the unaffiliated seekers out there who might find new life in Quakerism. How can we introduce more of them to this community, this culture, this spiritual stream, for their sake and for the future of the Quaker tradition? My own introduction came at Pendle Hill, the Quaker living learning community near Philadelphia, a place I discovered in 1974. I was 35 at the time, actively in search of a sense of meaning, purpose, vocation. Born in Chicago in 1939 and raised in the Methodist Church, I graduated from Carleton College in 1961. I got married that summer and spent the next year at Union Theological Seminary in New York City, where God made it very clear that the ordained ministry would not be a good idea for me. So I changed course. Thinking I might be suited for academic life, I went west to Berkeley, where I spent much of the 1960s as a graduate student in sociology. When I finished my PhD in 1969, cities across the US were on fire, ignited by systemic racism. So I changed course again, feeling called to use my sociology on the streets rather than in the classroom. I left academia and moved with my family to Washington, D.C., where I became a community organizer working on racial justice. I learned a lot from that work, but after 5 hard years, I was on the edge of burnout. So my wife and I began talking about a sabbatical year at a place that would be good for both of us and our 3 kids. We visited 4 or 5 sites, but found nothing that met our family's needs. Then grace intervened. I met a woman who happened to be a Quaker, a tradition we knew little about. She told us about Pendle Hill, a place we'd never heard of. That spring, we visited this residential adult study center rooted in Quaker faith and practice. Feeling deeply at home, we knew we had found the right place to take our next step. So in August 1974, I took a leave from my job in DC. We loaded up a U-Haul trailer, drove to Wallingford, Pennsylvania, moved into an apartment on the Pendle Hill campus, and began our sabbatical year as adult students. When we arrived, I had every intention of returning to community organizing after a year of renewal. It never occurred to me that I might discover a deeper vocation in this off-the-radar place. But from day one, I got clues that this might just be the case. I have a vivid memory of opening night at Pendle Hill when our class of 35 adult students gathered with about the same number of resident staff. The first speaker was Douglas Steer, one of Pendle Hill's founders and a revered Quaker elder. His comments were so striking that I recorded them in my journal. Everyone in this room, he said, made a big decision in coming to Pendle Hill. You left your homes for at least a while. You left friends and maybe family members behind. Some of you left your jobs and your sources of security. All of you are taking a risk. So I'm sure that you have good reasons for coming here, and you know exactly what they are. But keep your eyes and ears open. In a few months, you'll discover the real reason you're here, and way may open in a new and unexpected direction. As our student year went on, I learned that friend Douglas was right. I had come to Pendle Hill for much more than rest. Over the next 6 months, through meeting for worship, life in community, the classes I took, and time spent in solitude, it became clear I was being called in a new direction and that Pendle Hill was the place to explore it. So, in the spring of 1975, towards the end of our student year, when Pendle Hill began to search for a new dean of studies, I applied and was chosen for the job. We tied up loose ends back in DC, then returned to Pendle Hill in the fall of 1975 and remained there until 1985. That's how my one-year sabbatical stretched into another decade. It's hard to say what first grabbed my attention as I became immersed in life at Pendle Hill. Everything about our daily routine was new to me. Never before had I lived face to face with a diverse, very diverse crew of 70 people with whom I ate meals, did physical work, took classes, shared stories, searched for meaning, made communal decisions, and reached out in care for the world via nonviolent social change. All of that made a big impact on me. But the most lasting impact came from being exposed to 3 ways of gathering, Quaker style, that were staples of our life together: meeting for worship, meeting for business, and meeting for learning, as I came to call our classes. And I want to say some words about each of those forms of meeting tonight. Meeting for worship was the first thing to strike me. In fact, it struck me hard, but not, I'm sad to say, in a good way. Seasoned Quakers tend to forget that the silence can be daunting for some people, and sometimes the vocal ministry can strike a newcomer as odd. I still recall the day when birdsong from outside the meeting house inspired someone to speak at great length about the bird within. Please forgive me for how snarky that sounds. I've matured a little bit since then, and today I myself might speak on the bird within. But please understand, before arriving at Pendle Hill, I had spent 35 years worshiping in places where everything was programmed. The only words of ministry I'd heard were from a text or from a preacher trained to connect the text with today's issues. At Pendle Hill, where anyone could speak about anything, I heard things that vexed me. Fortunately, Pendle Hill was a community where I could talk about my vexations, no matter how wrong-headed I was. In dialogue with a few wise elders, I soon came to understand that the source of my distress was not meeting for worship or the folks who spoke in it. I was distressed that my so-called faith was no longer being propped up by the clerical guidance I'd become dependent upon. Here's one way to put it. I came to Pendle Hill with an exoskeleton of faith that needed constant reinforcement. As it fell apart in the silent meeting, my faith began collapsing, and that made me angry. Once I understood that, I was able to use the silence to rebuild my faith from the inside out, based on my own experience of God's movement in my life. It's not quite that simple, of course. We often need the help of a community to discern what is of God and what is not, a topic I'll return to later. But for the moment, my point is this. In the daily meeting for worship, my exoskeleton of faith fell away, Then, as I confronted the old Quaker question, what canst thou say from the evidence of your own experience? I began growing an endoskeleton of faith rooted in personal experience that continues to grow to this day. It was a major turning point on my spiritual journey to experience a form of worship that challenged me before it became a source of comfort, challenged me to develop a faith that was truly mine. As my inner journey grew deeper at Pendle Hill, my understanding of what it means to live in community grew deeper too. That's bound to happen when you live face to face with a diverse collection of 70 folks through the ups and downs of daily life. People who hunger for community often romanticize the benefits of life together. It's true that community offers many gifts, such as access to shared resources and mutual support. But to get to those gifts, we have to deal with the challenges that come when we imperfect beings pool not only our light, but also our shadows. From day one at Pendle Hill, I began learning things about life together that never came up in my doctoral work in sociology. After a few months, I summed up one of these learnings with a new definition of community. Quote, community is that place where the person you least want to live with always lives. And when that person moves away, someone else arises immediately to take his or her place. Now let me decode what I mean. When you live in a close-knit community, you often see reflections of yourself in other people, and you don't always like what you see. This brings both a blessing and a challenge. The blessing is the chance we are given to see our own broken places, places that we must acknowledge if we are to become whole. The challenge is to stop projecting our own shadows on others and embrace them as our own. If you keep playing the blame game, you cannot survive in community, let alone thrive. Of course, community also creates genuine conflicts as folks collide around different needs and different ways of getting them met. But when we learn to hold our differences creatively, conflict stops being the death knell of community and becomes an invitation, a gateway into deeper community. That's a truth found in every arena of life, from family and friendship to democracy itself, especially now as embracing the potentials of diversity becomes key to the American future. The Quaker tradition knows a lot about holding conflict creatively, more than I can explore here. But much of it is rooted in a spiritual discipline called patience, which also roots in a word that means to suffer. The kind of patience required in the Quaker practice of making decisions by the sense of the meeting, sometimes called consensus, rather than by majority rule. Majority rule is driven by a need for speed that too often results in decisions that alienate the minority and create future dysfunction. When we have to win at least 51% of the votes to get things to go our way, we learn to do what I call adversarial listening, listening for what's weak in another person's case in order to shoot it down. But when we make decisions Quaker style, we learn to listen for what's strong in other people's points of view, listen for what we might join hands with as we work toward a sense of the meeting. The proper name for a Quaker business meeting is a meeting for worship with a concern for business. I remember a Pendle Hill meeting for business that focused on a very contentious issue. Everyone was primed to speak about it, so the meeting promised to be very long. I thought the clerk might want to save time by abbreviating the 10 minutes of silent worship we always had before the discussion began. Instead, she called for a longer than usual silence. 30 minutes later, when we got to the discussion, I was astonished at how smoothly a sense of the meeting emerged. The silence had allowed the roiling waters to settle, and the listening became very deep. As it did, the way forward became more clear. When we do business this way, underneath our listening to each other, we are listening for an indwelling spirit that calls on us to transcend mere opinion rooted in ego or self-interest or narrow life experience. If we are to make progress toward the beloved community, toward love, truth, and justice, a lot of that kind of listening will be required. In my second year at Pendle Hill, as I began my job as Dean of Studies, I was walking across the campus when I saw a small sign among the plantings that bordered the walkway. On it, someone had inscribed a quote from Martin Buber: "All real living is meeting." Those words stirred something in me that's still with me today. Before I got to Pendle Hill, I thought I knew what the word meeting meant. It meant tedious gatherings that I did not want to attend, where people argued with each other about unimportant things, took a vote that left a lot of people unhappy, then went home with a headache, hoping that the next meeting would not happen anytime soon. At Pendle Hill, I quickly learned that the word meeting means something quite different to Quakers. Whether it's a meeting for worship, a meeting for business, or a meeting to celebrate a marriage or grieve a death, a Quaker meeting means an opportunity grounded in silence for people to wait upon the Spirit in community. Every meeting of this sort has a chance to become a thin place where we can feel the connection between the visible and invisible worlds. At the time I ran across the Martin Buber quote, "All real living is meeting," I was reflecting on my new job as Pendle Hill's Dean of Studies. I was responsible for the curriculum, for the teaching staff, and for helping to create conditions under which adult students could do their best learning. What might happen, I wondered, if we began thinking about a Pendle Hill class as a meeting for worship with a concern for learning, or in brief, a meeting for learning? What would happen if we opened up the space within us and between us to invite a deeper form of learning than conventional education makes possible? So I did what I always do. I started writing about the idea, drawing on the Pendle Hill classes I'd taken during my student year, as well as on my prior experience as a student and a teacher. In May of 1976, at the end of my first year as dean, I published my jottings in an 8-page Pendle Hill bulletin titled "Meeting for Learning, Education in a Quaker Context." The idea of a meeting for learning seemed so natural to me that I thought I might be plagiarizing without knowing it. But as it turned out, those words gave Quaker educators a new way to think about their work. They sparked a discussion about how the Quaker understanding of meeting might transform education, just as it has transformed worship and business, a discussion that's actually gone beyond the Quaker community over the years. So what is a meeting for learning? Well, here's a brief sketch. For starters, it's not a competition for grades. It's a communal exploration of a meaningful subject. For example, a literary text, an historical narrative, a body of data from the natural world. The students working collaboratively are the explorers, while the teacher serves as a clerk or facilitator of the process, keeping things focused and maintaining boundaries. That process honors the norms of fact and reason, but it also asks us to open ourselves, as we do in meeting for worship, in ways that make us as vulnerable to the deeper reaches of life. In a meeting for learning, we not only interrogate a subject, we allow the subject to interrogate us. We not only ask about the content of a poem, we also ask what the poem reveals about what's inside of us. We not only look into the horrors of the slave trade in the US, we also allow that history to examine us, forcing us to reckon with the darkness in everyone that threatens to overcome the light. With an education of this sort, we have a chance to learn not only how the world works, but how we work. A chance to gain the kind of self-knowledge that is the key to wisdom. All of this emerges from what happens between us, between teacher, students, and subjects, as we come together intentionally in a space called a meeting for learning. If I had to name one Quaker insight that's had the greatest impact on me, it would be the Quaker understanding of how to hold the space between us in ways that make room for the movement of the spirit. Quakerism has a genius, I think. I don't hear it talked about much, but I think it's there. A genius for social architecture that our world needs. It's the genius that allowed Quakers to design spaces where we can experience the way the sacred flows into the stuff of daily life. Meeting for worship on the occasion of business, and meeting for worship on the occasion of learning. Nowhere does that genius become clearer, I think, than in the Quaker discernment process called a Clearness Committee. The structure of this practice, the ground rules that govern it, create a safe space for the inner teacher to speak. It's a space where we can be vulnerable in ways that are just too dangerous to practice in conventional social settings. Settings where we might get exploited. But in the safe space of a Clearness Committee, we can listen to the inner teacher and be led to personal transformation. In the Clearness Committee, a small group gathers around a focus person who's wrestling with an issue of some sort, for example, a vocational decision. The gathering is rooted in the conviction that all of us have access to the voice of God within us, the ultimate source of the guidance we need. But we have other voices within us as well, don't we? Voices of fear, jealousy, greed, bigotry, self-denigration. So we need help in discerning the voice of truth from all the others. For Quakers, reliance on the inner teacher is balanced with reliance on a community that can help us sift the wheat from the chaff. But the role of the community is not to tell the person with an issue what to do. Instead, it's to clear the way for that person to get in closer touch with their own inner guidance. That's where the ground rules for a Clearness Committee come in. For 2 full hours, members of the committee are prohibited from trying to fix, save, advise, or correct the focus person. That is, we're prohibited from doing what we normally do when someone asks for help with an issue, offering our advice. What you or I think the focus person should do does not matter. We are not him or her. Our job is to help the focus person find a way forward that arises from within. So the ground rules for a Clearness Committee allow us only one way to address the focus person. We may ask honest, open questions to help that person draw closer to their own inner teacher. As it turns out, asking such questions is a high art. When I teach the Clearness Committee on retreats, I do an entire session on how to ask honest, open questions, questions that are not advice in disguise. Have you thought about seeing a therapist is not an honest, open question? The best questions are those that invite the focus person to reach deep for a response that has integrity for him or her. When members of a Clearness Committee abide by the ground rules, we create and protect a respectful space of deep listening, where we can hear the focus person into speech. Deeper and deeper speech. I stole that phrase from a feminist theologian named Nell Morton, hear the focus person into speech. We are not there to engage that person in conversation with us. We are there to support that person in having a deepening conversation with themselves, with their own inner teacher, with that of God within them. Whenever I start to doubt the reality and power of the inner teacher, and it's not hard to fall into such doubt in our world today, I know it's time for another Clearness Committee. Time and again, this way of being together offers evidence that everyone has an inner teacher whose wisdom can be accessed when we are held this way in community. Now I want to turn to the question I posed when I began this talk. How can we get better at sharing the gifts of Quakerism with people who are standing in the need of what this tradition has to offer? As I've just suggested, I think it has a lot to offer. Unfortunately, and this is among my many limitations, I must limit my remarks to the North American situation, which is the part of the Quaker world that I know best. But I'm well aware that Quakers in other parts of the world have much to contribute to this discussion, and I look forward to hearing from them. In the US, millions of people no longer identify with what were once the dominant forms of organized religion, but they continue to seek a sense of meaning and purpose, intensified by the times we live in. North American Friends have been in steady decline for the past 50 years. We now number about 75,000 members and attenders. How can we introduce more of those millions of seekers to a tradition that might speak to their needs, and through them bring in resources that we need? Well, I think step one is to name those needs as we see them, lest we end up offering answers to questions no one is asking. Here are the three needs I hear the most about. First, people need to feel seen and heard for who they are and for what they are becoming as they seek purpose, meaning, and a sense of vocation. That's a hard need to meet in a society, a mass society, that leaves so many folks feeling anonymous and ignored. Second, people are looking for a form of community that offers mutual responsibility without suppressing the individual's uniqueness and inner journey. That's hard to find in a culture where community often means conforming to a group norm in order to be accepted. Third, in our conflicted time, people want to know that it's possible to meet and build trust across lines of difference. They want an experience of diversity that leads to personal, cultural, and political enrichment and creativity, not to the suspicion, resentment, and anger we live with right now. What evidence do I have that Quaker faith and practice has the capacity to speak directly to all three of these needs? Well, for starters, I have the evidence of my own experience, the experience I shared in the first part of this talk. Here's a brief review. First, on the need to feel heard and seen for who we are and are becoming. From Douglas Steere's words of welcome when I arrived at Pendle Hill, when he said, "You all have good reasons for coming here, but in a few months, you'll discover the real reason you're here." I knew I had landed in a place where I would be given space to clarify who I was and support for who I was becoming. I was not given the Quaker formula for a good life because there is none. Instead, I was given a Quaker process for discovering the life I was called to live and the trust that I could work it out. Second, on the need for community. As the weeks and months went by at Pendle Hill, I discovered a form of community where the invitation to be vulnerable in sharing our stories, our hopes, and our fears helped everyone grow from within. We were growing from the taproot of our own lives, but not in isolation. We had steady access to each other's experiences of finding and following our leadings, a shared process of seeking in a nurturing but non-invasive community, a community of solitudes, a way of being alone together. And third, on the need to build trust across our differences. In the form of community I found at Pendle Hill, we had multiple opportunities to learn each other's stories. And the more we learned, the less possible it became to dislike, distrust, or dismiss each other. As we came together in everything from worship to work, we had to deal directly with the challenges of diversity. We did not have the option of avoiding or evading each other. As we dealt with that fact on a daily basis, diversity went from being a threat to being a source of creativity and a spur to growth. I called this talk, "All Real Living is Meeting, Close Encounters of the Quaker Kind." That subtitle is not only a reference to a famous science fiction movie, it's a reference to what can happen when we hold the space between us in ways that have come down to us through the Quaker tradition. The close encounters people look for these days are, I believe, generative encounters with that which is deepest in themselves and in others. What will draw more seekers our way, I believe, is direct experience of those encounters in the kinds of spaces Quakers know how to create. And I have some evidence for that claim. 25 years ago, I founded a nonprofit organization called the Center for Courage and Renewal, which is still going strong today. We've brought tens of thousands of people together in spaces shaped by Quaker principles and practices, spaces we call circles of trust. We have several hundred trained facilitators who offer retreats and programs in the US and abroad for people in many walks of life who seek to live and work with integrity in our challenging times. Many who've experienced our circles say that what they learned there is unique. They had never had such experiences before and has made a difference in their personal, vocational, and public lives. They have taken our core practices back to their families, communities, and workplaces with meaningful results. Though we have no formal Quaker affiliation, more than a few of our participants have become curious about the tradition that informs our work, and some have visited Quaker meetings to learn more. Now, I think there's a lesson here that bears on the future of the religious society of friends. Quakerism is an experiential tradition that's hard to comprehend through words alone. There's an old axiom that says, you don't think your way into a new kind of living, you live your way into a new kind of thinking. That's exactly how my life and work became redirected at Pendle Hill as I experienced the tradition personally and in depth. I want to be clear. As a writer and speaker, I believe in the power of thinking and of words. So I'm a big fan of projects like Quaker Speak, which has been hosting online teaching about Quakerism for the past 10 years. I simply believe that an important allied step in introducing more seekers to the Quaker way is to offer them short-term, face-to-face experiences of the kinds of Quaker spaces and practices I've talked about tonight. Experiences that can change people's lives, whether or not they become fellow travelers. How might we do that? Here, I'm going to ask you to do some supposing. Suppose we brought together a network of Quaker institutions drawn from Friends General Conference, Friends United Meeting, Quaker schools, colleges, and retreat centers, monthly meetings across the US. Suppose that those organizations that join this network were equipped, trained to offer one-day Circle of Trust retreats for the public several times a year. Suppose that those retreats featured not presentations about Quakerism, but experiences of certain Quaker practices in action, practices that can help people meet certain needs. For example, a retreat might include sharing personal stories to express identity and build community, training in how to ask honest, open questions to deepen our understanding of each other, and an opportunity to experience a Clearness committee around personal issues, all of it followed by reflection. As I've learned time and again over the past 25 years, all of this can be done with folks who have no prior Quaker experience. Folks who range from physicians to nonprofit leaders, to attorneys, to philanthropists, to social change activists, teachers, all kinds of people in all walks of life. And every bit of it gives people an experience of the Quaker way. So to assist our supposing, I'll give this project a name, Walk the Talk. Suppose that Quaker Speak and Walk the Talk joined forces. Suppose that Quaker Speak devoted a few programs to folks talking about the power of the inner teacher, then tagged on an invitation to a Walk the Talk retreat, where seekers would have a chance to see the inner teacher at work in a Clearness committee. Just suppose. I think it's worth remembering as we look toward the future of the Quaker community, that Quakerism is a movement, not an established church. And movement history has many precedents for the kind of project I've been talking about. In the 19th century, the land-grant university movement helped American farmers become more productive by establishing demonstration farms where farmers could visit and try new techniques, not just talk about them. The civil rights movement of the mid-20th century was strengthened by programs like those of the Highlander Folk Center, where folks could gather to practice the tactics of nonviolent social change, not just talk about them. Who knows? Maybe someone at Earlham School of Religion will feel called to put together a project of the sort we've been supposing here. And maybe call the Lilly Endowment to find the resources to move it forward. As Douglas Steer suggested on my first day at Pendle Hill, you may think you know why you're here, but time may show you something different. To leave time for some silent reflection, followed by conversation, I want to bring this talk to a close with some words from the great Quaker teacher Thomas Kelly, words that I've been thinking about ever since I began writing this talk. Speaking of what can happen when we gather in ways that are open to the Spirit, Kelly writes, "In the gathered meeting, the sense is present that a new life and power has entered our midst. In the gathered meeting, the sense is present that a new life and power has entered our midst. Whatever name you give it, that new life and power is key to the personal and social transformation we need." At its best, the Quaker tradition is devoted to transformation, not self-preservation. It's devoted to offering the world ways to walk in the light in word and action. So the purpose of the project I've proposed is not first and foremost to get people to join. It's to share the gifts of the Quaker tradition as widely as we can, letting go of outcomes and trusting in the movement of the Spirit. I believe that a project of this sort has the potential to bring people our way. But even if the Quaker movement should someday disappear, we still have a mission to pursue. Let us leave a legacy of close encounters of the Quaker kind, a legacy of various ways people can come together that make room for that new life and power to enter our midst and transform our lives. And with that, I'd like to invite us into a time of worship. And when he is ready, Professor Tom Ham from Earlham College will begin hosting us in a conversation.
Thank you, Parker, for sharing those moving and powerful thoughts. Oh, it helps if we turn this on, doesn't it? Again, thank you, Parker, for sharing moving, powerful thoughts. As the old friends would have seen, this is indeed a feast of fat things. We have had the main course. Now we will go on to dessert, which I hope will prove to be equally nourishing. First, I would like to thank folks here at ESR for the faith they put in me working in a situation that involves technology. My experience has been that I exude an aura which causes technology to malfunction. So if we run into glitches and hiccups this evening, you will know the reason for that. Secondly, we will have people speaking, asking questions, making comments, both in person here and on Zoom. So one hope is that we will be as precise and succinct as possible in our questions and comments in order to allow the maximum number of people to take part, ask their questions, make their comments. Third, if you are on Zoom and are seeking recognition, please use the raise hand function on Zoom. That will bring you to the top of the screen in front of me and will allow me to know who I should be calling on. And of course, when you do speak, please remember to unmute yourself. Finally, if you are posting something in chat, if at all possible, we would like you to speak up and voice your comment or question so that all can hear it. The chat function may not be easily visible to everybody in the room here, so that would facilitate discussion. So, let the dialogue begin. Who would like to move first? Michael Burkle. And if you are here at ESR, please wait for a microphone to be delivered to you.
Thank you. I think the microphone is working. Parker, I want to thank you for your definition of community. I've used it often in the classroom with one slight addendum, which is that if community is where I'm most likely to find the person who really drives me bad, then I have to accept the possibility, even the probability, that I am that person. And this gets me to my question, which is that it seems to me you hold, of course, wonderful tools and wonderful suggestions of how to engage the world where it needs to be met. And it seems to me that maybe the dynamics are different when the person you're facing is someone who's already interested in encounter and meeting and conversation and maybe having their mind change. We live in a society that has other kinds of encounters as well, where the person doesn't seem to be ready to make that step of trust, or is less interested in opening the treasure box and pulling out what is precious to them, and maybe more interested in pulling out their gun case. I know it's a terrible, but they're interested in conflict, promoting conflict, winning. And so it seems to me the dynamics of that kind of situation might change. Do the responses change? I just thought I'd ask a question if you have any thoughts on that. And it's great to see you. Thank you.
I'm so sorry to say that about half of what you said, Michael, I could not understand or hear because of the echo in the room. Tom, you were coming through very clearly. Is there any way for you to summarize the question? I'd love to respond, and greetings to you, Michael.
Sure, I will do my best. Can you still hear me, Parker?
I can.
All right. Michael, thank you for your wonderful definition of community, but to perhaps overly simplify Michael's question, I think that one question he was raising is, how do we deal with people in a community who don't seem to want to be part of community as we understand it, who, for example, have as their first motion to reach for a gun case, as opposed to seeking additional dialogue. Does that do faint justice to what you were trying to communicate, Michael?
Yes, I meant the gun thing is the metaphor.
Right.
And I think you're only saying half of what you were saying, half of what I said. That happens to me all the time.
All right, Parker. Again, I missed what Michael said in his PS, but I'll do the best I can here. So it seems to be true that community is that place where the person you least want to live with always lives, by the testimony that Michael just offered. And it's certainly been my experience that that we mirror each other, and when I'm reactive to what the other person is doing, the other person tends to dig in even deeper to his or her own shadow. There's no easy formula for a way ahead when you come to loggerheads that way. But I did learn a couple of things at Pendle Hill that have stuck with me. They don't work 100% of the time, but one is that some people grow up in this society learning that the only way they can get recognition is to be obstructionist or argumentative or a naysayer in every situation. When a community can truly empower everyone's voices and help wean people away from the need to be obstructionist or the need to pick a fight in order to get recognized, people can grow. I've seen it happen. Does it happen with every human being 100% of the time? No. But I'll use myself as an example. I think I was in my first year at Pendle Hill, this story I told about being put off by meeting for worship. We had a term paper that we needed to write every term of the year there, the 3 terms of our student year. And I wrote a term paper on all that was wrong with Quaker meeting for worship. I was a very objectionable human being in that context. I was challenging the very heart of the enterprise. And there are all kinds of reasons for that. I'd gone to Union Theological Seminary. I'd studied the sociology of religion at Berkeley. I thought I had that world by its tail. And somehow there were elders in that community who, instead of getting riled up and reactive to what I said, let's talk. And they let me spew. They let me foam and vent. And slowly, I was able to work through to an understanding that what was being poked by meeting for worship was a weakness in my own spiritual journey, as I had understood it to that point, which, as I said, was externalized rather than internalized. So this is not to say that there aren't people, okay, I'll just let it fly, who are sent here directly by the devil to destroy Western civilization as we know and love it. But as I think as we're all learning in recent years, there are parts of Western civilization that really need to be destroyed as we know and love it. That aside, I understand that there are persons whose agenda is to take things apart, to bring them down rather than to build them up. I don't think there are as many of those people in a community that genuinely invites everyone's voice and tries to empower everyone's voice. At least that's been my direct experience, not only in my 11 years at Pendle Hill, but also in the work that I have done for the last 25 or 30 years.
Thank you. We have a question on Zoom from Barbara. Barbara, would you unmute yourself and address your question?
Okay, thank you so much. And Parker, thank you so much for doing this. It meant very, very much to me. But like you, I was born in 39, and I feel the weight of all there is existing now in our country that we need to be working on. And with the challenge that I'm hearing here to do more, do another idea of opening, can just walking in the light be enough, or do we keep stretching ourselves? I get awfully tired.
Sure. Yes. Thank you, Barbara. We all get tired. Let's just acknowledge that up front, and that we have to include some form of self-care. If you haven't read a wonderful book called See No Stranger by my friend Valerie Carr, it's I think a new look at what nonviolence can look like in our world, and it's a feminist approach to social change, and she includes a very important element of self-care in a book that is quite powerful and transformative, I think. See No Stranger. Her last name is K-A-U-R, Valerie Carr. So I've done a lot of work over the last 25 years, more than I did when I was at Pendle Hill, with Black social activists, especially younger social activists, but the middle-aged and older activists I know as well, who have taught me a lot about simply by referring to their reliance on the ancestors. And what I take from them is that they consult the ancestors with great regularity in a way that in my experience at least, white people don't do. For one thing, I can't trace my ancestors back very far, but a lot of the Black activists I know have worked hard on that and have clearly been able to trace them back to human enslavement and all the horrors that flowed from that. What they honor in the ancestors is the willingness of those ancestors who had less than 1 degree of freedom to use what freedom they had to take the steps that they could take. And that step by step, prayer by prayer, meeting by meeting, action by action, they were able to build a legacy upon which younger Black activists continue to construct transformative social change. At 85, I'm an ancestor already, but not too long from now, we'll join the active roles of the ancestors. And I'm very touched by the reliance of the activists, the Black activists I know, upon 13, 14 generations of people who had very little to show for all their efforts, for all their suffering, for all the input they made, but who at the end of the day showed faithfulness to the task. And it seems to me that that's the standard for my life too. Yes, I'm tired, and yes, I have less capacity in many ways than I had 10, 20, 30 years ago. But there are still things I can do, and to do them as regularly as possible, I think, is the definition, the meaning of faithfulness. Am I being faithful to my own gifts? Am I being faithful to the needs of the world as I perceive them? And am I constantly trying to perceive them through other people's eyes? And am I being faithful to where those gifts and those needs might intersect? I have real empathy for the question and for the place from which it comes. But in my case, I feel the sense of hope that can come from holding the fierce urgency of now, which weighs upon us heavily, in creative tension with the patience of 14 generations of ancestors. That's at least one way of putting the paradox. And I want to say again, in closing, I take your question very seriously and wish we had more time to talk about it. But in laying down my response, I want to say again, the project that I'm proposing is not simply about recruiting new Quakers. I think it's about offering to the world transformative spaces where I've seen, through the work of the Center for Courage and Renewal, I've seen things happen in practical situations, in healthcare, in education, in religious life, in social change, that are the result of people discovering their own identity and integrity in these spaces and learning how to bridge differences and tapping into that power and presence that Thomas Kelly was talking about.
Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
I think we'll try alternating back and forth between on-site and on Zoom. So we have a question here, and I'm going to invite people here to come up to the microphone. That seems to be working best.
There's a good idea.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Parker. I'm Bridget Moix. I serve right now as General Secretary of Friends Committee on National Legislation, and I'm a member of Baltimore yearly meeting. And I was just at Pendle Hill last week, and it is still the place of nourishment and deep care that you experienced. And I was born in 1974, the year you first went there. So it's just wonderful to hear your words of wisdom and all you've talked about. Thank you so much. My question goes back to a couple things you said about, one, embracing diversity and the need that our world has for that now, which I very much appreciate, and Quakerism being a movement of transformation, and that being open to that personal and social transformation is core to what it means to be Quaker. I really resonate with that. I also struggle with the reality that, at least here in the US, our communities our Quaker meetings and organizations don't reflect the diversity that we embrace and we say we embrace. And why is that? And how do we do better? How do we change ourselves? How do we open our community to transformation that can invite more people in to become more of that beloved community that we want to be? So I would love to hear your thoughts on any of that.
Well, thank you. And thank you for your work with FCNL, the organization that I value very much. Had a chance to speak with them a few years back, which was a great experience. So your question and the challenge that's in it strikes me in so many ways. Let me see if I can sort a few of them out. I've always been struck by the fact that during the civil rights movement of the mid-20th century, there were powerful partnerships between Black activists and Quaker activists, as well as Catholics on the political left, the Berrigans and so forth. Those people hung out together. They nourished each other. They resourced each other spiritually and strategically and practically. But they didn't worship together, not normally, not often. And I've wondered sometimes, could we see this not as necessarily a question of diverse peoples all coming together in one form of worship or another, but as working partnerships on the urgent tasks of the world, work worth doing, where what's at stake is not necessarily praying together, but working together, which can, of course, as we know, be a form of prayer in action. I puzzle about this a lot because I used to get, as a young sociologist, I would get calls from mainline Protestant churches, mainly saying, would you please come and work with us on issues of diversity? We want to open our congregation to more of the wonderful variety and range of the human expression of life than all of these white people that we have sitting in our pews every Sunday. Would you please come rescue us from being a homogeneous white congregation? And the answer I learned to give to that question, and I'm pressing this a little bit because, not because I have an answer, but because it's another thing that vexes me. I would say, no, I won't come and do that work because it's a total and complete myth that you are a homogeneous white congregation. What you are is a bunch of white people suppressing the differences that actually exist between you. Political differences, ethical differences, differences in points of view about what the world needs and how to get it done. You're suppressing all the differences that you contain among you at this very moment for fear that if you got too close to them, the whole thing would blow up. And so if your homogeneous white congregation is so anxious about the internal differences that already exist within your community, why would anyone with a visible difference want to join you? Anyone with a visible difference would sniff out very quickly that these people are not comfortable with difference. These people are keeping it on the surface. These people are phoning it in and not reaching deep. So when I talk about the diversity that was at Pendle Hill, the diversity was very modest in terms of race and ethnicity, but the diversity in terms of people's stories and what we learned about each other's inner lives, our struggles, our hopes, our fears, that's what struck me. And that's where I started becoming more comfortable on the map of human diversity by realizing that we all just need to look at each other and say, welcome to the human race, because these struggles unite us rather than divide us. A very personal way of speaking about my dilemma on the question you raised is this. I am most at home in two forms of worship. One is the unprogrammed Quaker meeting, and the other is the Black Gospel Church. I am profoundly at home in the silence, and I am profoundly at home in that music and in the rhythms of the preaching and in the call and response. I don't know any place where I can put those two things together. and I don't feel a need to. What I feel a need to do is to say, we turn the prism, the light gets refracted in different ways. Let us honor all the ways of refracting the light. And I know that's not an adequate answer to your question, but it's the best I can do.
We have David Spector on Zoom. David, if you want to unmute yourself.
It takes an extraordinary amount of honesty to say that Quakerism has been on the decline. It's not something that we always want to face. I love the meetings I've been associated with. I love the people. But I see a limitation that we don't confront. That limitation has to do with our core of being silent, settling, discovering that there's something more, something that isn't represented in our usual daily life, something that unites us, something that can lead us, something that can help us come to decisions. There's so much good in sitting in silence as a group. But I ask whether it's enough. I ask whether it really is the basis for the kind of transformation that involves real basic change, dropping things that are useless, gaining things that are helpful, dropping suffering and gaining peace and happiness. Can we be effective if we drop our suffering and gain peace and happiness? I think so. I think that we can be more effective at social change. I think that we can be more effective at inspiring people who might be interested in joining Quakers. But it takes more than just sitting in silence and having a thin veneer of philosophy backing that up. I would like to see Quakers take a look around us at the various theologies and philosophies that are available, and to see that there is one that is so incredibly compatible with what we do and how we grow and what we want to become. And I will name it. It's called non-duality, and it comes from an ancient Indian tradition called Advaita Vedanta, which is a mouthful. And if we don't know much about Indian religions, philosophies, we can instantly think that's not for me, that's not for us. But in studying various philosophies, I see such a congruence between non-duality and Quakerism. Non-duality says that not only are we cheerful inside, not only are we divine inside, but our true self is free of any imperfection. It's free of any suffering. It's free of any need for stories. It is eternally content. What a way to live a life. Being content first, then speaking. If we could live that way, then it seems to me there would be no problems. There would be no problem with gaining new members for the Religious Society of Friends. we would have a unified, complete story to offer that includes a philosophy and a practice. We already have a bit of the practice. There are more aspects to the practice that we could add that would make it much more powerful. We even have the inspiration from George Fox, who said, "I see an ocean of light over an ocean of darkness." Now, I know that George Fox was.
If you could draw to a close.
I will now come to a close.
Thank you, David. I appreciate the insight into the tradition that you've been studying and clearly practicing. A lot there that I can't comment on. And I agree with you completely that sitting in silence is not enough. It's a starting point. What I learned at Pendle Hill, my own experience at Pendle Hill, was that sitting in silence was part of a much richer mix of community life that animated me to in my vocation. And I just want to say very briefly, because I'm not trying to make a sales pitch here for the work of the Center for Courage and Renewal, but when I got to a point of realizing that there were insights in the Quaker tradition that I wanted to share with the larger world, I didn't ask myself how to reform the Religious Society of Friends, although I kept nurturing myself and I hope the meetings with which I've been affiliated. Instead, I took those insights into a different kind of movement, a movement that was designed to operate in the secular world, a movement that draws to some extent on some of the philosophies that you're talking about. There's a kind of Buddhist component in our movement where the emphasis is very much on embracing suffering and thereby transcending it. So as a model of where to go with some of our reformist thoughts, it's at least plausible to me that that it's a creative thing to do, to start something new and to offer these gifts up to the world in new ways. Thank you for your comments.
Yes, here. You'd like to come forward?
Hello, my name is Janaki Parker. I'll bring you greetings from Pendle Hill, where I serve on staff. So I'm used to being the youngest Quaker in most rooms. I'm not here today. We've got an 8-month-old and a few people who are younger than me. I'm also a therapist, and I found it very hard to be a young person in Quakerism because there isn't a way in. When we're talking about the future of the Society of Friends, we're talking about who is going to be around for the next 80 years. And my question is about how we meet the challenges that younger people are facing as the way that things have been is disintegrating and nobody feels like there is solid ground. And I have found some solid ground in the Quaker tradition, but it was really difficult to get there because the assumptions are of middle-class people in their 60s who have a solid ground already. And so I work with trauma and I work with grief a lot in my therapy work, which is separate from Pendle Hill. I should be clear. How do we bring the Quaker traditions to people who have been affected in this way and don't necessarily have the grounding or the trust in community. Like I can't envision how that would happen. And I'm hoping that you and other people in this room can help put some tangibleness on that. How do you get over that hump?
Mhm. Mhm. Thank you. I want to lift up one of the first things you said, and I'm sorry I missed your name.
I'm Janaki.
Janaki. Thank you, Janaki. One of the first things you said, Janaki, was there's not a way in. And I want to lift that up for everybody's thoughtfulness and reflection. Because it's often the case in a religious setting where the people who are there feel at home, that they just don't see, they don't get it, that the newcomer who walks in is not given a pathway deeper in. And I know that happens especially with young people. It also happens with folks who look different or who come from a different background and have a different life experience. One thing that I've often done with churches, I haven't done this with Quaker meetings, but with mainline churches in the past, is asked a newcomer Confederate to go visit the church with, sincere intent, someone who was a seeker, and then brought that person back after a month of visiting on Sundays or first days to report to the congregation what that newcomer experience was like. And those reports were often very startling and hard for members of the congregation to hear. But it's a way of calling it to people's attention. But the deeper thing I want to say is this, and I'll have to refer again to the Center for Courage and Renewal and the 25 years we've had for it. A bunch of us started that when we were in our 40s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. And after 10 years or so went by, we realized that we were already missing the viewpoint, the perspective of folks in their 20s and 30s. And so we began doing a series of funded retreats for young activists. I think we probably did 10 of them around the country. These were 3 or 4 day retreats where the basic question was, what do you have to teach us about this work that we want to do with your generation? Help us reshape this institution before we go too far down the road and our forms and our processes get congealed. That experiment, which went on for 5 or 6 years of offering these young activist retreats all over the country, yielded new board members, it yielded new facilitators, it yielded new retreat models. And we're probably at a point where we need to do the same thing again. And I don't know what that is going to look like or might look like within the Religious Society of Friends. But I do think if some folks, supposing that I did tonight, were to get out there and offer opportunities for younger folks to come and sample, experience some of these fundamental processes, there'd be a lot of learning on both sides. So it seems to me, if you choose the right people. The other thing I want to say, Janaki, is there is no ground on which to stand, is there? And I think that one of the things we've done at the center is to do a lot of intergenerational dialogue. And I hugely value my conversation partners who are in their 30s and 40s around these very issues. But I think there's an intergenerational an intergenerational conversation around none of us can find solid ground on which to stand these days. I'm 84 years old. My own mortality is, of course, at the front of my mind. A dear member of my family recently died of complications from COVID, so that kind of experience, of course, brings it home even more. But I'm also looking back on the wreckage, as are a lot of activists, social change folks, the wreckage of what a lot of folks worked really hard on over the last 40 years. And you realize that in the religious world, in the political world, in the economic world, there ain't no solid ground. And your own mortality raises that question in a different but related way. So I think that's to refer to our earlier friend about suffering, that's a suffering that we can fruitfully share with one another, and from which we can learn, and into which we can walk together with maybe some new results.
Thank you, Parker.
Thank you, Jenica. And
Now on Zoom, we have Julia Forsyth, if you would unmute yourself.
Hi, Parker. This is Julie Forsyth, and I
Hi.
met you in 1975 at Pendle Hill as you were taking up the deanship. And so when the question of ancestors comes up, I need to tell you that you are one for me. I'm very thankful for that. And I guess my question is, as we think about our tradition, which is so rich, you mentioned too, Douglas Steere, Thomas Kelly, and we could go on and on and on from there, who I consider my spiritual ancestors and ancestresses, I guess. But I find in the Friends meeting here that through adult education and so on and so forth, how to bring newcomers into that sense that I have, and so many of us in the meeting have, which is deeply unspoken. You know, those voices are just with us. They hold us up. And you can't just hand it to somebody else in a way. So I don't know if you have any thoughts or guidance about that, but I think that question about ancestry is really critical. I think it has everything to do with how we can have confidence in one another and in the community, especially in the darkest times. I'm not a particularly big fan of hope per se, but I'm an enormous fan of relying on the power of the ancestors.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You said you weren't a big fan of
Hope.
hope. Gotcha. Okay. Thank you.
I'm one of those no hope, no fear people. So
Right. Got it. Thank you, Julia. And thank you for your kind words. Yeah. It's, you know, I was raised in the unprogrammed tradition of Friends. For those who aren't Quakers listening in, that's a whole conversation that I couldn't quite get into tonight. Programmed and unprogrammed. But in unprogrammed meetings, I guess it's often the case that over time, the sense of history slips away because there's no clergy person sort of charged with preserving that sense of history and passing it on time and time again to the congregation. And that is one thing that I miss about the mainline Protestant tradition in which I was raised, where ministry at its best meant keeping the collective memory alive.
yeah.
Although obviously aging changes memory and sometimes loses it. So how to do that, I don't know. For me, one of the great insights of the Quaker tradition that I didn't have a chance to talk about tonight, there are so many, is the whole idea of continuing revelation.
Yes.
That God didn't stop speaking in the 4th century when some people decided to codify God's word, but that God speaks today in Ralph Ellison and in James Baldwin and in Mary Oliver,
Yes.
in Wendell Berry. You know, on and on the list goes. And this I think connects a little bit with the question about the younger generation. Ask the younger generation who their elders are.
Yeah.
Ask them who their teachers are.
Yeah.
I'm betting that for some of us who've tried to keep listening to the voices of contemporary culture, we would find some overlap in our lists of elders. And it could start very simply as a program of shared reading, which wouldn't have to be onerous and heavy. It could just be going to the well and refreshing ourselves with Baldwin or Mary Oliver or whoever, and finding in that way a synergy between the young and the old that might help enliven meetings and sort of update our ancestry. I was transformed as a community organizer. I was started on this journey a bit when I was a community organizer by discovering Thomas Merton.
Oh, yeah.
And reading The 7-Story Mountain.
Sure.
At the time, that seemed so fresh and so deep and so insightful to me. I can't read The 7-Story Mountain and get the same, charge from it anymore. And Merton himself said he wished he'd never published the book because he froze something in time that didn't stay with him. He said, I wrote that book with the zeal of a convert. And that, by the time he'd gotten around to Zen and the Birds of Appetite, that was no longer the case. But I just think there's something in there in sort of treating the ancestors as, I'll use some computer language, even though Tom might not appreciate it. There's the ancestors 1.0 and the ancestors 2.0 and the ancestors 3.0, and we can sort of keep updating who those ancestors are. It all depends on who people are turning to.
Yeah.
Just some thoughts. It's lovely to see you.
I think I saw another hand here. Back here or here? I think that hand was first, but if you want to defer.
Hi, Parker. My name is Ben Snyder. I am honored to help lead a programmed meeting in Western Yearly Meeting. Thank you for being with us tonight. I guess I want you to help me solve a problem. At our best, I think friends are really good at inviting people to the table. At our worst, we divide ourselves up a lot. And I'm mindful of, especially in the last few decades, we've really split, decided that we didn't want to sit at the same table. And I guess my question, I really appreciated the idea of finding new ways to invite seekers to be part of us. I think at our best as friends, we're all seekers. We're all looking for something. One of the things I've been looking for is reconnection with not just all people, but with friends. Do you have any thoughts on how we might be able to, better reunite some of these friends who've left the table, invite people back into conversations and community with one another, even despite our differences. I guess what I'm asking is, can you fix all the divisions and put them all back together nicely? Oh, no pressure.
Right. In 3 minutes, right? Well, no, I don't have a lot of ideas about that, but I appreciate your passion about it, and I share the heartbreak that comes when people within a tradition who have reason to believe that they're somehow within reach of each other decide to come apart in dramatic and hurtful, often hurtful ways. So much pain in that kind of splitting up that you need a therapist rather than an organizer, it seems to me. Reconciliation should be part of our work, at the heart of our work, really. After all, the Religious Society of Friends was named after that great verse where those who follow Jesus are his friends. And however you read that or understand that or hold that, there's a resonance about friendship that is that we long for in our lives. And at the same time, I don't want the focus on who it is we need to be reconciled with to be too narrow, if that makes sense. Yeah, we need to find ways to keep the door open to all forms of reconciliation. And if some of our one-time brothers and sisters want to come back our way, or if we want to walk toward them and say, can we break bread together? That's important. I'm all for that. But I believe there are a lot of hungry people out there who have become radically disaffiliated from religious traditions that were once meaningful to them, who are hungry too. And sometimes maybe you get what you want by not aiming directly at it, but by just keeping the food coming to the table and making sure that whoever walks in the door is welcomed. There's something about, I mean, I've hung out in the old days, I hung out at Church of the Savior in Washington, DC, for example, which modeled what I'm trying to talk about so well. And there's just something about that constant serving of the bread and the soup and the coffee or the weak tea that creates an energy of attractiveness, and people start coming your way. It's an act of faith, I guess, is how I see it, that you just keep putting out to the world without asking, am I getting the right list in the door? Or am I getting the results that I want? You just keep offering it up. Maybe I'm just reflecting an old guy's view at age 84, thinking, well, all I ever did was to keep offering it up, even though a lot of what I hope for, dream for, is being reversed. But there are currents moving in the other direction as well. It's a pretty complex force field these days.
Thank you.
I do not see any raised hands on Zoom, so I think this will probably have to be our last question this evening.
Well, I'm very aware that Quaker Midnight is coming up soon, so.
Hello, Parker. Thank you very much for your talk. My name is Jackson Napier. I'm a member of Berea Friends Meeting, and my yearly meeting is the Southern Appalachian Yearly Meeting and Association. I want to ask you for advice because I am losing my faith in Quaker process. The more time I spend in meeting for business, the more pettiness and one-upsmanship I see. I have seen members speak to every item of business out of spite and anger and not out of a spirit of collaboration and attempts to solve the conflicts that we are facing. I'm 32 years old. I'm really struggling to find a place for myself within committee work. My time is so precious and limited that I just, it feels so outdated. I'm really struggling to find a place for myself within business processes, and like, I'm engaged, I want to start a family in the near term future, and I'm just really struggling by witnessing all of the passive conflict and attempts to conduct business over email and Facebook, and people not showing up, and there being conflict, and I feel so utterly powerless as a witness to this. So can you help restore my faith in Quaker process? You've been doing this a lot longer than I have, and I know I understand that you have a history with Berea Friends. So I would just appreciate any insight you could offer me. Thank you very much.
It's Jackson, is it? Did I get it right?
Sir.
Jackson, thank you, Jackson. Yeah, it's true. I joined Friends through Berea Friends when I was visiting professor at Berea College back in the mid-90s, I guess. And the meeting that you've just described is qualitatively different from the one that I joined and experienced during my time there, which of course happens. You never step into the same stream twice. You know, I've read something, I've read minutes and notes from the meeting about some of the struggles that you may be referring to. And COVID, of course, to say the obvious, has extracted a huge price from all of these forms of face-to-face human interaction, which get thwarted and distorted when we get online. It's a lot easier online to be snarky, to be passive aggressive, to phone it in than it is when we're face to face. Although you may be talking about some face-to-face interactions as well. I don't know. But to the extent that it's online communication, I think that the problems you've named are reflected in a whole variety of institutions. And what to do about that, I don't know. I mean, I'm not there tonight because my doctor said not a good time to travel, maybe this summer, but given your pre-existing conditions, best to stay home. So don't know how to solve the problem of relying on technology, which serves us well in some instances and not well in others. I'm going to go back to what I said at the end of my talk for just a moment. Things die. It's part of life. Everything falls away, and you know, sooner or later. And particular meetings have death throes, and then they die. And those energies, if there is life among them, have to be reconstituted and reconstellated in some other place in some other way by people who are willing to change the earthen vessel, to break the earthen vessel, but not willing to let go of the treasure. When I was your age, I was pretty alienated from a lot of different forms of institutional life. I had walked away from several of them, walked away from ministry in the church, walked away from academia. But I was very interested in the heart of those enterprises and what I respected and valued in those enterprises, and the whole question of how it might be reconstituted and reconstellated in some other form. And that essentially is where the Center for Courage and Renewal came from, which I didn't do alone. I did it with a lot of good colleagues, with a strong community of collaborators who were feeling the same call at the same time. And so I guess the best I can do, Jackson, is to say, whatever it is you value and treasure, if you find it being trashed in the situations where you had every reason to expect those things would be valued as you value them, shake the dust from your sandals and go find different ways to use those treasures, but never lose the treasure. The earthen vessel can go, but we should never let go of the treasure that it contains.
Thank you.
And on that note of hope, of sadness, of being aware of how friends are subject to all manner of human frailties, even as they seek a divine leading, we will close for this evening. Thank you again, Palmer, for being with us. I feel certain that you have spoken to a variety of conditions this evening. So thank you again.
It's been a privilege to be with you, and blessings to all.
And we are concluded. Thank you, friends.
Thank you.
Sure.